It gave us Gangnam Style. It probably made your TV and your mobile phone. But now South Korea is being stunned by an extraordinary scandal.
김 씨는 여기서 만난 무허가 직업 속.
The story began 2 years ago when a mother was reunited with her son. He'd been rescued from a remote island where for years he'd been held as a modern-day slave. The authorities have now rescued hundreds of trapped, often unpaid workers. They fit the UN definition of slaves. Shockingly, many are mentally disabled. This is where it's happening. The Shinan Islands in the country's Wild West. There are over 1,000 of them, but only 80 are inhabited. A mainstay of this economy is this gourmet salt and the back-breaking labour needed to harvest it. This is one of the two things that South Korea's Shinan Islands is famous for: mineral-rich, organic salt. The other is slavery. The latest victim has just been rescued. It's just emerged that a man who was held in captivity for more than 30 years has been freed, and I'm on my way to the port city of Busan to meet him. Chung Gi-hong and Chung Byung-ae are brother and sister. Just 8 weeks ago, she learned from police he was working on the islands. She hadn't seen him for 30 years, since he vanished as a teenager.
고생에 왔다 갔다 하니까 옷을 한 보자. 양말 뭐.
양말 안 빨은 게 있다.
What makes the case all the more shocking is that Gi-hong has severe learning disabilities because he had meningitis as a baby.
아니 아가야 양말 신는 사람은 니밖에 없을 거야. 이런 양말. 응?
Which are your favourite ones?
누가야?
좋죠.
요런 게 좋아? 여기 좋아? 애기가
네, 여는 거.
옷도 알록달록한 거, 애기같이 막 애기같이 알록달록한 거 좋아하고.
What do you think? Do you like my socks?
양말은 어때요? 좋아? 아 이거 안 돼.
여는 게 좋대.
I like yours too.
여는 게 좋아.
Age 19, he accepted a stranger's offer of work, but he says it was a trick. There was no job, only slavery. Over 3 decades, he was passed from farmer to farmer and says he was treated with appalling cruelty.
장애인이기 때문에 대우를 못 받고 그곳에서 그렇게 강제적으로 잠도 안 재우고 자기 주인이 기분 나쁘면 애를 마음대로 들고 팰 수 있는 매 맞는 도구예요. 정말 매 맞는 애고. 그러니까
How did they beat you?
근데 뭉디도 두들고 펼 수도 있고
뭉둥이가
손으로 두들고 펼 수도 있고.
그래요? 어떻게 됐어요? 왜 그랬어요?
마사가 그랬대요. 마사가. 그래서
It's hard for me to believe, but it seems there are dozens of people who have been in the same position.
아직까지 많이 있지.
Chung Gi-hong told us police investigators missed him last year
안 먹어?
because his employer hid him. He's sure people like him are still suffering on the islands. I don't know if this question makes sense to you, but how did you feel when you were there? Did you feel lonely? Did you feel sad? Did you feel angry?
그렇게 살다가 나도 죽으려고 몇 번 내가 죽을 고비 여러 번 느꼈어요. 지금까지 한 번은 죽으려고 농약까지 먹었어요. 제가.
너무 고통스러운가? 얼마나 고통받았겠어요? 얼마나? 그래서 정말 이 나라가 원망스러울 텐데 너무 고통스러워 정말.
That's very upsetting. It sounds like he was in hell for those years. That was one of the most extraordinary interviews I've ever done. he's a big, strong guy in his early 50s, but he's also severely brain damaged. He likes watching cartoons and he likes wearing socks that a 3-year-old would like, colourful socks with cartoon characters on him. And his severe learning difficulties and his obedience and his sweet nature make him open to the kind of exploitation that went on. It's just difficult to believe that anyone would be cold-hearted enough to exploit him, to abuse him in the way that his sister recounted. It's truly shocking. Incredibly, in South Korea, one of the world's most developed countries, disabled people are being used as slaves. I want to understand how this can be happening. I'm on my way to the port city of Mokpo. This is where Ji-hong was sent more than 30 years ago after he was recruited at a station in Busan, but it's still a centre for the trafficking of disabled workers. It's a 3-hour ferry ride across open sea from Mokpo to the Shinan Islands. And this is the ferry terminal that serves these outlying islands. These islands are remote and they're also the place where the reports of abuses have been worst. This is the route the victims took out to the islands, lured by false promises of work, learning too late that they'd been trapped. Because these boats are the only way anything can come on or off the islands, whether it's salt, food, or forced labour. This is just an early morning ferry out to the Shinan Islands. So it sounds crazy to say that I feel slightly paranoid. But everyone I've spoken to who's made the trip out to the islands has spoken about this feeling that they're being watched from the moment they got on the ferry, and particularly when they got to the islands. They're very close-knit communities. Until recently, what happened on the salt and seaweed farms on these islands was hidden from the rest of the country. This is tiny Okdo Island. It only has about 200 houses on it. And Chong Ki-hung, the man who was a forced labourer for more than 30 years, spent several of those years on this island working at a seaweed farm. I'm going to go see if it's still here. The first person I meet is Sung Hong-ju, the owner of one of the island's small farms, out for his morning stroll. 안녕하세요. My name's Marcel. Nice to meet you. We're making a film for British TV, a documentary, and I would like to ask you about disabled people. Okay. He doesn't want to talk about disabled people, but he will show us his seaweed farm. Mr. Sung explains he runs this island's only seaweed factory, which leads me to suspect he's one of the farmers Chung Gi-hong worked for. Seaweed is a big part of the Korean diet, and he sells millions of sheets a year. This is the easy part. Once the seedlings are ready, his workers replant them in the ocean. It's cold and difficult work. Mr. Sung invites me and my Korean colleague for a cup of coffee. He admits he's been questioned by the police about one of his workers. It's my chance to ask if it was Chung Gi-hong. Did he used to work for you?
이놈 바로. 이놈 어디서 갔어?
He says that he was a forced labourer for more than 30 years.
바로 이놈이에요, 이놈. 금년 저 앞서 한 몇 달 전에 경찰서에 사출이 왔어. 경찰서로 나오라고. 얘가 고발했다고.
He denies beating Chung Gi-hong and insists he paid him.
꼭 일을 안 비록 건조를 부린다고 그렇게 때립니다. 아주 질적으로 나쁜 놈이에요.
Did you beat him?
때리기를 바란 것 같아. 뗀 사실이 없거든.
네요?
그러고서 몰랐어. 지체장애가 있는 줄은 몰랐어 그랬더라.
I didn't know he was mentally disabled.
You didn't know he was mentally disabled, but it's obvious that he's mentally disabled.
눈이 무서워. 몸도 좋고 그러니
He's
누가 뗀 사람이.
The guy I met was clearly mentally disabled and vulnerable. He remembers him as a bad man who wouldn't do any work. And I don't know how to make sense of that disparity. Part of me thinks that maybe he's got no concept of mental disability, that maybe he thinks that Ki-hong was behaving like that because he was, naughty or bad. Feeling like we've worn out our welcome, we catch the ferry back to Mokpo on the mainland. In Korea, this is a town famous for gangsters. It's also full of bars and cheap lodgings for sailors on shore leave. The homeless men who sleep outside Mokpo station tell me most days traffickers visit them. In fact, only 20 minutes ago, a trafficker offered them beds for the night at a hostel he runs.
일본에
공nem장.
인구도 있고 아니라 이거 이것도 하고 일도 맞춰보기라. 일도 맞춰보고. 좀 안 좋지. 대표 불문은 못 나오게 장으로.
Eventually, I find the hostel. From here, the trafficker sends workers to the islands and onto shrimp boats that spend months at sea. The lights just came back on. It's locked and barred, and we can't get in. 안녕하세요. That's the address that was given to me, and it's an inn where a human trafficker lures vulnerable people, gets them into debt by offering them accommodation and drink and entertainment. Then they can only pay that off by agreeing to work for him. So the next stop from here is a shrimp boat or a salt farm. It's called debt bondage, and it's a classic feature of modern-day slavery. The lack of anti-trafficking laws in South Korea makes prosecutions difficult. That's why, although the police have rescued hundreds of trafficked and abused workers, there has only been a handful of convictions. The police have taken some of the victims to this shelter in Mokpo. Officially, it's for homeless people, but most residents are also mentally disabled. The centre's run by Lee Jong-un. And what percentage of the homeless people here are mentally or physically disabled?
대략 한 80% 정도가 80%가 정신 질환을 가지고 계시고.
These disabled people have nowhere else to go. Korea spends less on welfare than any developed nation other than Mexico. Disabled people here are twice as likely to be living in poverty as those in other developed countries. No wonder they're tempted by the false promises of the traffickers.
서기상 씨.
안녕하세요.
네, 서기상 씨고 이분이.
안녕하세요. Seo Ki-sung was rescued by the police from an island salt farm in December.
그 사람들이 때리기도 했나요?
이제 창고에서 가져가지고 몽둥이로 캐고 그랬어.
얼마나 때리던가요?
나 창고에서 엎드려라도 그랬었지.
엎드려라 해가지고.
예.
대략 몇 대씩이나 때렸어요?
대량 많이 맞았지.
대략 많이 맞았어.
밤중 그것도 밤중에 때렸으니까요.
밤에 자고 있는데 일어나가라 해가지고.
예. 그래서 이제 그 염정 주인의 집에 안 가려고.
I'm introduced to other former salt slaves. Among them, Lee Jang-sung, who was rescued in March.
이제 몇 년 일하셨어?
6년 일했어요.
6년? 6년 일했는데 돈 하나도 안 받았다? 왜 안 줬을까 그분들이? 안 줬어. 돈 주라고 얘기 안 하셨어요? 돈 주라고도 얘기 안 해보셨어?
안 해봤어요?
돈 필요가 없던가요?
몰라서 그렇지 뭐.
He worked for 6 years on a salt farm
So far.
and got no money.
No money. 6 years.
So that makes him effectively a slave.
Okay, slave.
He was a slave.
Maybe slave.
Mr. Lee shows me his case files, full of similar stories. Why is this abuse happening?
일은 힘든데 사람을 구하기가 어려워요. 그리고 또 사람을 구한다고 해도 돈이 너무 많이 들어가기 때문에 요즘에는 그런 사람도 구할 수가 없습니다. 그렇기 때문에 이제 사회적인 약자들을 그런 쪽에 이용을 하는 거죠. 예.
As far as you're concerned, is this a form of abuse that's ongoing?
그리고 지금까지도 계속 그러고 앞으로도 조금 그런 게 완전히 해소되기는 제가 볼 때는 어렵다고 생각됩니다.
I travel back to the islands. Ruthless traffickers and farmers desperate for cheap labour mean every time the authorities think they've dealt with the issue, it resurfaces. This is Shinai Island. It's got lots of salt farms, and over the last couple of years, it's had lots of slavery cases. This is the epicenter of the salt farm slavery scandal. The police now inspect farms, but they missed Chung Gi-hong, whose last job was here on a salt farm just 2 months ago. I want to explore this island, where he spent years of his life. In a tiny hamlet, I find a disabled worker. The farm owner, Kim Chae-sun, tells me the police have visited him and he's doing nothing wrong. It's a chance for me to learn about the strange relationship between some farmers and their workers. What's your relationship to Mr. Kim? How would you describe your relationship?
아버지라고 그래요.
So you were a kind of father figure to him.
예, 그래요. 친아버지, 친엄마처럼. 사실, 다른 사람도 그래요. 친아들 애들은 밖에 가 있는데 저 애가 집에서 데리고 있으니까 오히려 저 애를 친자식보다 더 못한다고 그래요.
Mr. Kim.
김영주.
How nice to meet you, Kim Young-ju. My name's Marcel. 안녕하세요.
반갑습니다.
How long have you worked here?
오래됐습니다.
What about Mr. Kim? What kind of relationship do you have with Mr. Kim Sr.?
여기 엄마, 아빠, 또 나.
And if you weren't here, what do you think you'd be doing?
육교 밑에서 노숙자 생활.
When I ask him how he got here, he tells me that as a homeless teenager, he was targeted by traffickers.
거기 강주 고아원에서 나와서 노숙자 생활 행수로 누구 안 사람 잔면결혼 행수로 속에서 그런 데 가면 딴 데로 팔면 이제 완전 못 나온대.
Mr. Kim is registered 2 on a scale from 1 to 6, where 1 is the most disabled. So he has quite severe learning difficulties. But he says that if he weren't here, he'd be homeless under a bridge. And so this is the place he'd rather be. After a number of masters, he's found what he regards as a family. The problem is that other vulnerable people can't tell friend from foe. And I'm hearing some worrying news about Chung Gi-hong. His sister, Chung Byung-ae, tells me that a few days earlier, traffickers almost succeeded in taking her brother back to the islands. Now she's afraid to let him out of her sight.
절대 누가 이제 어디로 가자, 돈 많이 줄게, 돈 벌러 가자 해도 절대 누가 따라가자면 따라가면 안 되고, 에? 누나 저 사람이 나 어디 가자고 그래 하고 그러면 누나가 그 사람들을 혼내줄 거야 이제는, 응?
She explains Chung Gi-hong was tricked into getting into a taxi to Mokpo port. The traffickers had promised to pay the fare on arrival. Luckily, she found out in time to persuade the driver to turn around.
사진 찍어줄게.
She's determined to build a new life for her brother, going for walks with him every day and making plans for the future.
옳지? 좋아요.
She's got an announcement to make.
우리 기홍이는 지금 좋은 일이 있어요. 그래가지고 여러분한테 축복도 받고 싶고 축복받아가 결혼해가지고.
She's introduced him to a colleague's daughter called Gang Hyun Kyung, who also has learning disabilities, and they're engaged to be married. That's the most I've seen you smile since we've met.
우리가 10월달에 지금 결혼식으로 하려고 해요.
But she knows Chung Gi-hong is still at risk of exploitation. And I can understand why she's frightened. When I go for a stroll in a park near their home, it's full of vulnerable people. And watching them is a recruiter, a man who admits he's earned a good living from this place. Is this generally a place that headhunters come to find workers?
오기도 하고 업주한테 50만 원씩을 받아요.
He claims he doesn't target disabled people, but there's not much of a job interview.
개중에는 실제 검사를 다 하는 게 아니고 개중에는 모르고 가는 수도 있지 있기는.
Disabled people who've fallen through the cracks of South Korean society remain at risk of slavery.